Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, and I'm filling in for David Nazi here at Mixbus TV. Now, I am mostly a pop, hip-hop, R&B, reggaeton, EDM kind of guy. I work in a lot of genres that use a lot of synthesizers, program material, sequencing, things like that. What I don't typically do a lot of is rock genres. I've certainly done some, but I have never actually mixed a metal record in my life. So I thought it would be fun to mix a metal record for the very first time in my life here on Mixbus TV, and then show you the results, my thought process, and some of the techniques that I'm incorporating. So we're going to see how this goes. But before we get started, I think it's very important that if I'm going to play the part, I need to look the part. Our band today is Grin Cynic. I'm going to put their socials right here. It was recorded by Paul Cronk, and that was at Power Station Studios in Pompano Beach, Florida. I kind of dig this shirtless thing, actually. I get to show off my tattoos. I never get to do that. Anyway, metal. Let's rock. All right, so let's take a listen to what I've gotten myself into here. All right, I've finished my mix. Let's listen to how it turned out. All right, cool. So let's go through a lot of these ideas, right? So the big challenge here was the guitars, really. Like having space for everything while also making the guitars just eat everything alive. It's paradoxical. So how am I making that work? The way that I approached it was, first of all, to just start from the assumption that the guitars were correct as is. They sounded good right from playback. So for these guitars here specifically, I'm not really doing much. I'm high passing and not even all that high, and then I'm doing a little low passing as well, and we end up with this. Right, so it's basically just the way that they sounded. On the heavier rhythm guitars, that's where I got a little creative here. So here's our right rhythm guitar. And what I found was, unlike a lot of types of records like indie rock or pop kind of a mix, the guitar didn't really play well with the bass when I was taking bass out, which is a little counterintuitive, right? Normally you make space for other things in the mix, but in this particular case, I actually found that the rhythm guitars felt better when there was more bass in them and they blended more with the bass. So I am high passing, but actually a lot of the low end is still in there, and I'm even boosting some of the low end. So I'm doing kind of a smile curve here where I'm giving it weight and I'm giving it top end, and it ends up sounding like this. Now, interestingly, what I found was when I did that on the other guitar, it contracted the image. It actually made the guitar smaller. So if I were to pull this on over to my complementary guitar here, together they sound like this. But watch if I take this EQ off. In an interesting way, it's actually a bigger image, and the reason is because they have a contrasting tone. So I thought back to my days when I was assisting Denise Barbarita, who's a fantastic engineer, and she showed me this technique where when recording guitar doubles, you actually use something like a ribbon microphone, something that has a more narrow and low mid-weighted band range. because that ends up filling in more space and creates more contrasting space across the stereo field. So with that in mind, I decided to experiment and get a little creative, and I used the Slate Digital Virtual Microphone Modeler to create a completely different tone from my double. So it actually ends up lo-fiing it right away, and then I started going into more traditional techniques, but again, I was thinking more like low mids, lows, less top end, not as expansive of a band. So I'm taking down some of the bite that's at 3K, and I'm adding some low end here. And on its own, it's kind of sounding a little bit muddy and dark, taking out some of like the low rumble and opening up some of the low mids here. And then lastly, my favorite EQ, there's like this very strong, like 900 to 1K buildup that I wanted to pull down, but I also didn't pull it down all the way. I didn't do a complete notch. In a more pop kind of a record, or like a more pop punk, or something that was a little more commercial sounding, I would pull this tone all the way out. But here I'm easing it off by about 8.5 dB. And I'm just noticing now that that bite that I took out before, I actually added it back in here. The way that I process things, this is a do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. The way that I do it, as an idea occurs to me, I just put the next plugin on or whatever, which is probably not the best way to go about it, but it's just what I do. It gets me there, so it works. But anyway, I now have this very contrasting tone. And that creates a bigger expanse. So that required a little bit of thought and a little bit of technique. The other thing that I did that I have mixed feelings about that I want to point out is that the guitar DIs were provided, and I did end up using them. My idea was to create a sense of dynamic by making a more complicated tone in certain key areas. So I'm using in phase just to get the DI to align very closely with the amp capture, and then I'm using guitar rig, and I played around with a bunch of stuff. So I have like a wah pedal of all things, giving it some resonance and some bite, and then I've got this mezone, mezone, distortion, whatever you want to call it, and this amp. So basically just trying things and getting tones that I liked. So this DI layer, for example, sounds like this. So very nosy, very crunchy kind of sound. The other one sounds like this. Kind of gruff, kind of gritty. And I just bring those in certain areas where I want to add a little bit of energy. So right when the guitars are by themselves in the beginning, and then they drop out for where the vocals first come in, and then when the energy picks up, it comes in again. Some of the layers I got a little bit more creative here. So I've got this one, for example, which is almost more country twangish. And then this one, which is like pretty unique. Which makes sense for the section. I'll play the little section here. So I just thought it added a nice color to that particular area where it was kind of like this guitar breakdown, moody sort of zone. I think the reason the DIs were provided is in case I wanted to have the ability to access the actual attack of the note more. The distortion is really, really heavy on the amp captures. So if I needed to articulate the note, I could use the DI and I could reamp it and use a cleaner setting on an amp, or I could use a digital amplifier like Guitar Rig and use a cleaner setting and get more of the actual attack in there and blend that in so that the part of the note is more clear. But the guitar player's picking technique is so good here, I didn't really feel like I needed to articulate the note anymore. I felt like it was already pretty crystal clear. And then all the guitars come together, and I'm using a little bit of Spectre right in the mid-range. This is kind of like a saturation lo-fi thing. I'm using just a touch of it right around the very center of the mid-range. I find that that's like a special zone for guitars, where on the one hand you can pick up like a lot of room tony resonances, but on the other hand, that's where like a lot of those first order harmonics or second order harmonic octaves start showing up that sound really musical and cool. So yeah, that's the guitars. Now onto the bass. Bass was very simple. Here's the DI. The low end is super consistent. The playing is really good. Blended in with a little bit of the amp signal. Amp signal sounds like this. Which I brightened up a little. I added some 1.6K, but otherwise it's untouched. Oh, and I took out some of the buzz. I have a low pass going down pretty low. It's slightly nosier, gives it a little bit of presence. However, when I combined them, I found that when I liked the level of how they sounded together, once I was in there with the rest of the mix, I was really losing track of the bass guitar. Like I just wasn't getting the response from the bass that I wanted. It felt like it was getting eaten alive by everything else. So I created a distortion layer. This is one of those things where like I don't know if this is a good idea or not because it's a little transformative, and obviously this was produced and recorded with intention. So this very dark bass guitar was purposeful. But I felt like it would be cool if this bass guitar blended more with the higher guitars. So I created this parallel here with Faturator, which is like a really ugly distortion. It sounds like this. Like a genuinely hideous distortion, but when they're all combined, it actually sounds pretty cool. And then with everything else, it just ends up feeling really satisfying. So that parallel distortion layer, I felt like lifted the bass up in the mix and made it glue into the guitars. And it's very interesting because a lot of the times we're mixing for separation and clarity, but here a lot of what I did in this mix was actually try to make everything glue together. And I felt like that yielded the better results, which is very, very different than a lot of the pop stuff that I work on. Okay, moving on to the drums, there's definitely some cool stuff happening here. So overhead processing was pretty straightforward. The cymbals sounded really good in the overheads. I felt like I could get them significantly brighter without bringing up too much harsh stuff. I boosted about 5 dB at around 5K, and then a little bit of harsh stuff started showing up around 3K, so I'm doing like a complementary dip to take down the stuff that was getting harsh. At the same time, I'm boosting up the higher stuff that sounds good, and then also taking out a little bit of 1K where there's a lot of like the low part of the cymbal resonance because that cymbal is being played like the whole time. Sounds pretty washy. And then I'm using some compression here, and this is to extend the cymbal sustain because I felt like just having that cymbal as present as possible was very helpful to the way the record was being played. And then another layer of EQ. So I'll just kind of bypass it. Oh, hold on a second. We've got some other stuff going on that we're going to have to get to in a moment. Okay, there we go. So here we are, bypassed. And with my effects. So it's a little cleaner, a little crisper, and it's more cymbal focused. And that was basically the idea. There was really nothing like crazy or magical. This is stuff I'm sure you've all seen before. Where things do get a little bit interesting is that when the chorus picks up, you'll notice that the cymbal, the downbeat of the cymbal, doesn't really hit. All right, so if I go into this, there's not really any cymbal hit. So instead of automating, I decided I would find like a really unique set of crash cymbals that I could use to complement the sound of the record. And I came up with these. So one's a cleaner crash and the other one's this kind of like weird kind of noise, and together they sound really interesting in the record. They sound like they belong, but it emphasizes that downbeat by dubbing in a couple of cymbal samples. A lot of close mics were provided. There's a left cymbal mic, a right cymbal mic. I'm using them both. I'm not gating either of them out, even though the right cymbal is not being played too often. I ended up keeping it because I actually liked what it was doing to the dimensionality of the drums. Left cymbal is used a lot, so there's a lot of EQ here. The close mic on a cymbal is just like a recipe for harshness. So just doing these little EQ moves here to kind of get rid of some of the stuff I don't like, and then just pushing it up enough to reinforce what the overheads are already doing and make the cymbal feel closer. Same thing with the ride cymbal. I don't want to dwell on those too much. Snares. So in the last video I did here on MixBus TV, I talked about my snare layering technique. I definitely used that here. I've got my main snare right here. And I'm doing my three-part compression thing where I'm using regular compression to emphasize the attack and the punch, then I'm using limiting to emphasize the body, and then lastly I'm using clipping to get it as loud as possible. And no individual processor does that much, but when you combine them all together, it ends up sounding like this. So it ends up sounding like 4 or 5 dB louder, but at the same time it retains its punch and everything like that, and it gets a nice little color. I also have a parallel channel that I've clipped over. I've duplicated the track and then I've put a reverb on the end of it because there's a couple of sections in the song where I just wanted to make sure that the reverb was present on the snare. Most of it, I really just want the snare to be dry, but then when we get to these sort of like interval sections here, like pre-chorus sections, having a more reverberant sound seems to work. So I'll play that real quick. And then once we get back into the chorus, then it's back to being tighter and drier. Now, it's not completely dry. This is where things get fun. So I hit up my buddy Jordan Beal, who is an amazing drummer, and truthfully, I think has one of the best drum sounds in the game. Like, his drum engineering is fantastic. Very notably, if you've ever checked out the Icon Classic drums from Spectre Digital, he's the drummer and one of the engineers for that, and it's one of the best sounding Contact drum kits, sample drum libraries I've ever heard in my life. It's really just unbelievably good. And he sent me a couple of layers, and the layers sound really dope. So I'll play just the layer by itself. So these layers here, it's really just one thing. It's like this very low, fat, spongy, long tail snare, and when it's dubbed in with the main snare, it provides a sense of depth and fatness and allows me to get a sense of reverb without putting reverb on the main snare, which allows the main snare to stay close while at the same time having a longer tail. The second trigger that I'm using is for bite. It's really just for attack. I'm using one of my own drums, actually. I did a sample library called the Mayo Collection, and this is called Benzene Drip. It sounds like this. So it's a very tight, band-driven, very snappy sound. It does not have a lot of low end, and it works really, really well as a layer for exactly this purpose. And then I'm using Transify, and I'm doing transient exaggeration into gold clip in order to make this like very transient, bitey, sharp sound. And once that's layered in, this snare cuts through like a knife. So here's without the layers. Jordan's layer. Right, depth and weight, and then my Mayo snare. But you'll notice the most important thing here is that even though I bring in these two layers, the snare still sounds like the snare that the drummer wanted. It does not take away from the personality of the snare. So on Jordan's layer, for example, here, I'm cutting out a bunch of mid-range because that mid-range is where the personality of the primary snare lives, and it's really important to have that exposed. Kick drum, pretty similar. I'm using my own trigger. So here is I think the sample is like a one shot that's been processed off of the kick. So like they just recorded one hit of the kick by itself, processed it, and then triggered it with the live kick because they sound super similar. All right, that's the sample kick, and then here's the live kick. Right, it sounds basically like the same kick. So I think that it's the same kick and one's just being triggered. Together they sound like this. And then the main thing here was just being willing to like EQ the living snot out of the top end of the kick. This is not like a hip hop kick at all. Hip hop kick, I'm adding tons of lows if it doesn't already have the lows. Whereas this, it's like the lows almost got in the way a little bit. Like the lows were really being driven by the bass more than anything else. So the sub kick I don't have mixed very high at all. It's very subtle. And really what matters is that percussiveness, especially during like these little blast beat sections. Like without that extra articulation on the attack, those things just turn into like one stream of low end sound. Ooh, thunder. Very metal. All right. Then I have a trigger that's really just reinforcing the low end and the body here. I found a kick that actually ended up sounding pretty similar. I tried one of Jordan's kicks. I preferred this ZC Punch kick here. And you can hear it has kind of a similar tone and texture. So together they all sound like this. Add in the sub. Nice, solid, fat, beefy kick right there. Okay, so rooms, all this other stuff. There's gating, basic EQ cleanup. There's really not much to dwell on here. I think the next thing that's really, really interesting about the drums is getting down to the drum mix bus, because this is something I've been doing lately. It's one of those ideas where like you get the idea and you say, this is either really going to work or really not going to work at all. Like one or the other, but let's try it and see what happens. And I got pretty lucky because it actually sounds really, really cool. Okay, so what is it? I got down to my drum bus. I printed the drum bus. I took the drum bus and I uploaded it to ariamastering.com. So ariamastering.com is an automated mastering site that uses all analog process. It's automated. So it's like eMaster or Lander, but it uses a robotic arm to mess with outboard gear. In the ARIA window, there's 5 settings, and the most gentle setting is the E setting, which still does a little bit of limiting and a little bit of compression, but it's very, very light. So I have been uploading my drum bus, and I've been trying this in multiple genres, but it worked really well here. So I uploaded my drum bus to ARIA mastering, and I mastered it on the lightest setting, the E setting. I went into this advanced mode, and I turned the low frequency up 1 because it's designed for complete mixes, so it takes the kick drum down a little bit. So this is just kind of pushing the kick drum back up. But this E setting with the low frequency turned to +1, it ended up sounding really, really cool. So I'll give you the before and after. This is, here, let's get this soloed real quick. So this is our drums here. Genuinely not bad. Like I'm pretty happy with that sound actually, but here is our ARIA mastering drums. That's pretty cool, right? Like the fact that it even worked is kind of cool, but like the sound of it is really, really heavy and powerful. It's got like a nice compression layer, some really good saturations. It puts a little bit more energy and meanness into the low mids. And then in the context of the mix, I felt like the snare could come out, and I wanted specifically like the body of the snare. So I have the JST Transify on this. and it's cutting off at 4K. It's starting at 200 hertz, so it's pretty much all of the mids, from like the low lows to where the mids meet the treble, right? So it's the whole mid range. It's only coming up like ever so slightly. I have the attack turned up just a little bit, but it's enough to kind of lift that snare back forward. So here's a before and after. And you actually hear it in the context of the mix even more. So without it, it sounds like this.
On and on, seems like I push on.
And then with it sounds like this.
On and on, seems like I push on, all for nothing.
So it takes the snare and it puts it like right there, like right in your face, which I think is really cool. Okay, so vocals. Vocals were actually pretty easy. The main thing that was important with the vocals is just doing a lot of rides. There was already a pretty distinct compression on the vocals, so just going from section to section and making sure that the vocals, or even like words, individual words, were being attended to. So you can see here I've got like plus 7 dB within the clip gain. I've got 0 dB in the clip gain here, then I've got plus 4.5 in the clip gain here. So I'm just going through every single phrase and making sure that the gain right from the beginning is where I need it to be. And actually a lot of my automation is done in the clip gain with the guitars as well. So a lot of automation in terms of levels. Once I get my levels where I want them to be, it becomes a lot easier to manage the compression settings, the EQ settings, everything like that. So, okay, let's take off all of these effects and play it.
Here we are going overboard, keeping us all locked and floored.
So it actually sounds pretty good already. Like, there's a lot more processing on here than you would think based on like where we're starting from. So there's some minor stuff, like there's a couple of high mid resonances that show up. Like you can hear almost like a tea kettle sound in that. Like way up there. So just kind of cleaning up some of the mid range and stuff like that. I'm using this is one of my favorite channel strips, and this is like really full circle here because this is the BX console AMIC 9099. And the console that it is modeling is the AMIC console that is at Power Station Studios in Pompano Beach. So literally the record that, the console that this record that we're listening to right now was cut on is this plugin, like the actual version of this plugin. So I think that's kind of neat. But yeah, this is modeled off of the Power Station AMIC board in Pompano Beach. So, okay. A little bit of low passing, right? Just getting rid of some of the extra kind of shushy stuff. Otherwise, taking down a little bit of low mid, and then the big move here is notching out the tea kettle noise, right? That's happening at like 2.6, and then lifting up the top end in general. So quick little before and after here. Let's pop on back a few steps. There we go.
Here we are going Here we are going overboard.
It's not very different actually, even though it looks like it should be. Okay, then we're doing some very gentle compression. So it's like only 2 to 4 dB of compression because there's already plenty of compression on this, and I'm using a kind of medium fast attack and a medium fast release, and then I'm also easing off a little bit of the presence range around 4K. So before and after.
Here we are going Here we are going overboard.
And again, not so much of a change. We'll notice those changes more when the vocalist moves to the higher range.
Keeping us all locked.
Right, after.
Keeping us all locked.
So it clarifies things a little bit, and then also controlling that upper mid, because sometimes those upper mids get pretty strong.
Keeping us all locked.
de-esser for just a few moments and limiter for just a few moments where things get overwhelming, but otherwise not really all that different. And then if we just bypass and go through it, what you'll notice is that even though there's a bunch of plugins going on, the difference really is not that much. And that is very intentional because it sounded good to begin with. So why would I want to change it much?
Keeping us alive.
Okay.
Keeping us all locked and flow.
So just cleaning it up a little bit, and then a trim plugin at the end because it just needed to be louder overall. So with the doubles, I'm just copying these first three plugins, pasting them over. It's exactly the same thing. On this low octave, I did end up changing this. I wanted it to be more mid-range focused. I wanted to take out a lot of that low end, just so that the harmony was complementing, but was not getting in the way of any of the guitars.
Keeping us alive. Keeping us.
I think the big thing really was the ambience, figuring out what kind of reverb I wanted. In my mind, metal and hip hop actually are very similar in where they're coming from. So my feeling was to try to keep the vocals a little bit more dry, but I think that there's also some like classic rock influence that's getting into this record. So a little bit of ambience felt like it was helping out. The main ambience I'm using here is this Mooger Fooger analog delay, and this is really mainly just used to like add some dimension, but also thicken the vocals up a little bit. So if I play this.
Here we are going overboard.
And then I bring this in.
Here we are going overboard.
And that's the main reverb. Then I also have this soft tube true stereo, and that's adding the rest. Now, there is actually a fair amount of reverb here, but you don't notice it so much because most of the reverb is actually coming off of the delay.
Here we are going overboard.
And I definitely take this as like a more classic rock influenced approach rather than like a modern metal approach. I would suspect modern metal would want to be a little bit drier. But anyway, altogether, it ends up sounding like this.
Here we are going overboard. Keeping us.
And then in that breakdown area where I have the snare come in with the reverb, I also have the vocal reverb coming up in that particular area as well.
Games they play keep showing up. On and on seems like.
And that covers the vocals. So, really pretty straightforward. Just mixing in the harmonies. Oh, there is one like little interesting vocal thing here where there's these like cool harmonies that come in with this whisper vocal.
Your secrets, and I'll keep mine. There's nothing I would do in this life of mine.
So that I used Native Instruments ROM to create the primary reverb, and I used quite a bit of it. It's 43% reverb. Then Hoser from Boz Digital to clean things up, and also to push the mid-range really far forward. So it's like all 1K energy. There's like not a lot of lows, not a lot of highs, which I think is pretty important to making it fit. And then lastly, I'm using Enigma as like a comb filter to actually thin the sound out, not just add modulation. So I'll go through those one at a time. Yeah, okay. We'll start from here. So kind of a cool effect right there. So got to be a little sound designy with it, but overall, not like the craziest stuff either there. Okay, so that brings us down to the mix bus. So let's take off the mix bus effects. There we go. And let's play from maybe the chorus area, which I think is here. So, first of all, in my opinion, even without any mix bus processing, if I sent this off to a mastering engineer, I wouldn't be unhappy with it. I think that I've done my job pretty well. But in my mind, the less I need to leave for the mastering engineer, the better. So, the first thing I wanted to do is just generally fix the tone curve. I felt like it was a little subbier than I wanted, a little less primary bass than I wanted, so I needed to pull up the primary bass, a little more mid than I wanted, and a little less upper mid than I wanted. So I'm creating this tone curve where it's like rolling off sub, increasing primary bass, rolling down mid, low mids, boosting up upper mids, right? And then there's this one little exception to the rule right here where as I'm boosting up these upper mids, this one particular area got a little bit harsh. So I ended up dipping it back down. So let's do a before and after real quick. Sorry, before?
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark dry.
After.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark dry, violent day.
So it's just caffeinating the mix a little bit. It's just waking it up, but it's not like a humongous difference here. And then I wanted to bring some of that mid-range energy back in, so I'm using Spectre again, but I'm only using it on the side information, so this is primary affecting the guitars. So focus on the guitars when I play this before and after.
All for nothing. On and on. All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark.
So the guitars just come forward by like the tiniest little amount, and then that's happening in a way where it's not getting in the way of anything that's happening in the center. All right, mix compression. There's two stages here. The first is going to be the Townhouse compressor again. I like this compressor quite a bit. I like what it does to like the 200 to 400 hertz range. It adds a little bit of like fullness in that range in addition to the compression. And then for the compression, I was thinking of it a little differently. Like in a lot of the hip hop mixes that I do, I use the softer knee compression. So I use the 2-to-1 ratio on SSL style compressors, and that has a softer knee. The ratio and knee are tied together. Here I'm using a slightly harder knee. I'm using 4-to-1, and that harder knee produces a punchier transient. So I'm using a very light threshold with a slightly more aggressive ratio and knee. And then I'm using the slowest attack available, which is 30 milliseconds. I'm using the second slowest release available. I found the cymbals got a little bit too shushy, like it started to go shh, like white noise a little bit with the release that fast, at the fastest. So I slowed it down one tick to about 300 milliseconds. And then I'm using the makeup gain here, so before and after.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark dry, violent day. Now the time has come, I'm falling. All for nothing. Come in line.
It's a very, very subtle difference, but you'll notice that the kick drum and the snare get a little punchier. The guitars feel like they have a little more gravitas, and overall the record just kind of feels a little bit more connected, but it's a very, very subtle difference, right? So just because it says like it's doing 2 to 4 dB of gain reduction on the meter, that really doesn't mean anything. Even though it says 2 to 4, to my ear, it feels like lighter than that, actually. And then the last little bit here, there's a number of soft clippers that I really like for mix bus that I oscillate between. I like the Schwab Digital stuff, the gold clip, the orange clip. I like Master Plan, Music Hack Master Plan, which has like a soft clipper built in. But lately I've been using this a lot. This is the Cornif Audio Puff Puff Mix Pass. And the reason I like it so much, aside from the fact that it has like a really, really cool tone, is this dynamic slider. So another difference that I found between this mix and what I typically am doing with my hip hop, pop music, EDM stuff is where I set this dynamic slider. So typically for that stuff, I like a really, really full sound. So I'm using the dynamics more in the area here on the meter that says less, and it gets very boomy, it gets very boofy, and a lot of sustain stuff happening, very fat sound. But here, because I felt like this is more punch driven and needed a little more space to breathe, I ended up going more on the dynamic side, which I think is kind of cool. I'll give you sort of the example here. Let me just give you the before and after in general, and then I'll shift it around.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day. Now the time has come, I'm falling, all for nothing.
So let's see, we're at 32 and minus 27. So I'm going to turn this up to 100% so you can really hear it. And then I'm going to go from minus 27 to like all the way toward here. And you'll hear the difference.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day.
So on the one hand, it's kind of cool because the guitars really fly forward, but they all feel very condensed into the same space. And then the drums also start to really pancake out. They become very like flat topped. And I didn't really care for that. So I preferred it back down here where it was more dynamic. And I ended up landing around here. But for the pop and hip hop stuff, I actually do find myself getting into this less dynamic area. And then where were we at? 32, right? So the color is very distinct here. So I don't want to like overly color it in order to make the sound work. So this is, again, one of those things where those two distinctions are pretty subtle. But if I bypass them and play it and then bring them back in and then play it, you'll hear a pretty big difference.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day. All for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day.
That's the combination of the two. And then final limiter. My limiters are sort of a revolving door. I like the AOM Invisible limiter. I like the FabFilter Pro L2. And I like the Music-Hack Master Plan 1. This combination of sort of the more transparent sound of the Pro L2 mixed with the Puff Puff Mix Pass, I've been liking that combination recently. So definitely digging that. And that got us to the loudness that I wanted. So we can bring that in. And it sounds like this.
All for nothing. On and on, streets like.
So, you know, a lot of that is also in the pursuit of a very loud master. Like, we do live in the year 2025 where metal mixes, like every other genre at this point, you know, clients want the record loud. So I did things specifically with loudness in mind, and that's what a lot of that compression is also for. And this plays back pretty loud. We're in like the minus 7.5 LUFS area, which is, it's up there for sure. But it doesn't sound like it's lacking dynamic for being that compressed, actually, which is kind of amazing. Something I should have mentioned at the beginning, by the way, is that because I'm building my studio here in Miami, my home studio is down. All of my gear is at the commercial space I'm installing and doing all that kind of stuff. So while that's going on, all of my mixing I'm actually doing on my laptop and headphones. So I'm using VSX. And typically, so that's Slate Audio VSX. So typically, when I'm using VSX, I use Steven's Room here. But I found, interestingly, that the Yellow Matter Studio emulation actually was more conducive for me to get the mix I wanted to get. I don't know why that is, but I think it's pretty interesting. But yeah, so I mixed this all through VSX. Maybe one more time, I'll just play some of the final mix here, kicking in from the chorus, and we can compare it to the original where we started at. So yeah, let's start it from like right here.
On and on, seems like I push on, all for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day. Now the time has come. On and on, seems like I push on, all for nothing. On and on, streets like a dark, dry, violent day. Now.
All right, so it seems like a pretty good place to wrap up. I had a lot of fun doing this. I mixed metal for the first time in my life ever, which was kind of cool. Hopefully won't be the last. I actually really enjoyed it, and hopefully I just didn't embarrass myself too well. I think I did okay. In terms of me on this channel, you know, I've been filling in for David a little bit. I know that Bella is now thankfully out of the hospital. She's beginning her recovery. I know that the recovery is not going to be easy for either of them. So I'm just playing it by ear. You know, if David is able to come in, do his thing, then all the better. If he still needs me to pick up a little bit of some of the stuff, fill in the gaps, then I'm making myself available and just, doing what I can from, my limited position of what I can do. You know what I mean? So anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And I'm sure this will not be the last you see of me and Nozzy working together in some capacity for sure. All right, take care.